In this lesson, we will take a look at getting started with ASP.NET websites. We'll get started by showing you how to create an ASP.NET website project, and we'll take a look at the anatomy of a page and a website. One of the main things to be concerned with in ASP.NET is how code is separated from HTML. This is different from other languages such as classic ASP or PHP. There will be two files. One file will have all of our HTML markup in it, and it has a .aspx extension. And there will be an associated code file which will include all of our C# or VB.NET code that interacts with the page. We'll show you how to link those two pages together so that they can be processed and run as an ASP.NET web page. We'll also take a look at what makes an ASP.NET web page a web form. Every single ASP page will have a web form element that has a run at server attribute with it. This is done so that the form is registered with the server so that the server can interact with it in code. To create a website in Visual Studio, we start by going to the File menu, choose New, and Website. You'll notice that in our New Website dialog, we have several projects that we can choose from. ASP.NET Website is the project type we will choose. In the top right corner, we have the ability to choose which framework we'll be compiling towards. We can select, in Visual Studio 2008, we can select from .NET 2.0, 3.0, or 3.5. If you're using Visual Studio 2005, only 2.0 will be available to you. For this project, it doesn't matter which version you choose. I will just stick with the default of 3.5. Then we need to choose where we're going to store our project. We have three options in types of locations that we can store. If we choose File System, that will be stored to our local disk, and we'll be able to modify it from there. We can choose HTTP, which will allow us to connect directly to a website as long as the web server has front page extensions installed, or we can use FTP and we will provide the credentials and connect directly to an FTP site. If we choose HTTP or FTP, we'll be modifying the files directly on the web server. And since we don't want to do this, we'll go ahead and choose File System. As of Visual Studio 2005, we don't need to have actually even a web server installed on our development box, because if we choose File System, when we debug or run to test our website, there's a built-in web server that comes with Visual Studio that will launch, and the built-in web server will run the site. I'm going to go ahead and choose, I've got a C demos folder, and I'll create a new folder here. We'll just call it Getting Started. The name of the folder that I choose here becomes the name of the website. So unlike other Visual Studio projects, we don't actually give our website a project name. We just specify a folder, and whatever that folder name is, in this case Getting Started, becomes the name of the website. I can then also choose which language I want to develop in, C# or Visual Basic. I'm going to choose C#. Then I'll click OK. You'll see, as we come up to our Solution Explorer window, as the files get created, it creates a new solution called Getting Started. We have a folder, C Demos, Getting Started. That's the location of the site. There's some default folders that are added here. There's an app data folder, default.aspx, and an associated default.aspx.cs file, and a web.config. The web.config is just a configuration file. We won't get into that in this lesson. We'll talk about it later another time. The main files that we're going to look at is default.aspx and default.aspx.cs. If you're using VB, it'll be default.aspx.vb. We'll take a look here in our default.aspx. How are these two files associated? Now, number one, of course, we can see that they have the same name, default.aspx and default.aspx.cs, but that doesn't actually link them together. That's only for our convenience so that we can visually see and track those fairly easily. How they're linked together If we take a look, default.aspx opens up, and there's at the top of the page what's called a page directive. So we have this at page. If you've done any kind of programming in classic ASP before, you may recognize this angle bracket with a percent symbol. That means this angle bracket with percent symbol means that we'll be running this code on the server side, or that something will be run on the server. In this case, it's just a directive that will be run on the server that says, here's how to process the page. Every one of the elements up in here defines how we're going to use this. So number one, the language attribute tells us that we're going to be using C#. This attribute, auto event wire up, that basically says that we're going to, there are certain events, auto events that need to run. For instance, a page load event. If we want to have any code run in the page load event, we would go ahead and set the auto event wire up to true. If we know that there isn't going to be any custom code that we want to run in those auto events, like the page load, then we could set this to false, and the code might process a little bit faster. It would actually be a little bit more efficient. The two main things that we want to look at here is the code file. The code file default.aspx.cs, that tells us which file is associated with the HTML file or the ASPX file, so we know how to associate them together. That alone isn't enough, though. The other thing that we need to take a look at is this inherits. Inherits points to the name of a class, _default. That's the name of a class that's defined in this default.aspx.cs. Let's take a look at that. In my Solution Explorer, I will select default.aspx.cs. We'll double click on that, and we can come to the file here. We can see that there is a class, public partial class _default. The reason there's an underscore is because default by itself is a keyword. So normally, the class will just be whatever the name of the page is. For instance, if we had a new page called login.aspx, the public partial class would just be called login because that's not a keyword. But since default is a reserved or keyword, we have to put an underscore in front of it so that we don't have any confusion. Notice that it's a partial class. Partial classes are a new invention, that were introduced into .NET 2.0, not specifically for ASP, but just in the .NET 2.0 framework in general. So with this advent of partial classes, we're able to combine multiple classes. In reality, this ASPX file gets treated as a partial class as well. So at runtime, this HTML, the server-side code of this HTML, and this code that's inside of here get merged at runtime and run as though they were one class. That'll become more important as we go through and talk about controls and how controls are added and so on in another lesson. For now, let's take a look at the form, some of the anatomy of this page. Back in the default.aspx, one of the things to note in Visual Studio is down in the bottom left-hand corner, we can see with ASPX pages, we could switch strictly to design mode. That would take us to this page, and we could design by adding controls onto the page directly. We could go split mode, where it shows the source, the HTML source at the top half, and the design in the bottom. Or we could go strictly just to source, which is the default view when we open it up. If you are running Visual Studio 2005, the only two options you have is design and source. The split view was added in Visual Studio 2008. As we take a look at this form, you can see that there is a form element. Every single ASP.NET page has a form element because that's ultimately how the page needs to be processed so that we can have server-side processing. The form, like a standard HTML form element, can have an ID. In this case, it has a form 1, but it also has this run@server tag. The run@server tag is critical to ASP.NET. This is what notifies the server that this form element is to be processed on the server side. If we're using a run@server, we also have to have an ID, whereas with a regular form element, we don't need to have an ID. That's only generally when you use JavaScript. But in the case of a server-side form or an ASP.NET page, we have to have an ID that identifies the form and then the run@server. This is why pages or websites ASP.NET pages are generally referred to as web forms because they're based on this form. Any elements that we want to put inside, text boxes, buttons, radio buttons, and so on, need to go inside of this form. One major item that I'd like to discuss here as well, if you're familiar with programming in PHP or classic ASP, you might be used to adding multiple forms on a single page. You could still add multiple forms on a page, just as before. However, you can only have one form with a run@server attribute associated on an ASP.NET page. So in general, when you create ASP.NET pages, you will not see more than one form because you can only have a single run@server form. As we go through the lessons, you'll see some of the ways to get around the need to having multiple forms as you might in different environments. Let's just go ahead and create some basic functionality on this site, and we'll just add some functionality inside this div. I'll do it in design view down at the bottom. Just put name, and with the name I'll add a text box. As soon as I add a text box to my form, it's a good practice to go ahead and change the ID. Notice that text boxes, all the controls that I add also have an ID and a run@server. So we'll just change this text box to first name. Come down to next, I'll add a button. Put my cursor behind the button, hit enter to add a new line, and then I will add a label control. This will be a simple hello world type application. We'll put the username, or the user will put their name in the text box. We'll have this button to be able to click, and then the label will display the greeting. Some of the properties that we can set, I can set directly in the source if I want to, or in my Visual Studio, over in the bottom right hand corner, I have a properties window, and the label I will set the text to blank to begin with, and I'll change the ID to welcome label. I'm going to select the button just by clicking it once. Once I select the button, I'll also change the name of this button to submit button. And I'll change the name of the text, or I'll change the text property to say hello. As I'm working with these controls in design view, I want to be careful not to double click them unless I'm ready to write some code for them. So if I just select them, if I click on them once, it will select the control. You'll see that they become highlighted. If I click them twice, it'll create an event. So as of right now, the only thing I want to do is I want to double click this say hello button. I'll double click that. It will take me into code. Notice that it actually added a new function in my default.aspx.cs file. We have a submit button click, and I'll just add some simple code. We'll say welcome label dot text equals hello space plus first name dot text. So go ahead and run that. We'll go ahead and save that first of all. Before I run it, let me come back to my default.aspx. Notice I have the tab up at the top here. I can click on this tab, and you can see I have my name, or I have the text that says name, ASP text box, the ID of first name, and I have a line break. I have my button, the ID of submit button, run@server, and when I double clicked it, it also added this registration that registers the event. So in other words, when the user clicks it, the submit button click event will fire. Here I have my label, the welcome label, run@server. Let's go back to this event. When the user clicks it, the submit button click, and where does that fire? If we go back to my default.aspx.cs, you can see there's a function called submit button underscore click. That's the name of the function that will be executed. Let's save this, and in order to run this now, I could go up to my debug menu. Notice I could go to debug and choose start debugging. My icon shows me there's a little play button, so I could use that, or I could use a keyboard shortcut F5. I'm going to go ahead and click this right here. I generally like to use the keyboard, so F5 is the keyboard shortcut I usually use. We'll run this. First time you run a website, it will prompt you, if you start debugging, it'll prompt you to see whether you want to modify your web.config file to enable debugging. This is standard. Generally, you do want to do this, so we'll go ahead and hit OK to enable debugging, and that will launch the website. You can see in my website that I have a name here. The name, the text box, I'll go ahead and put in Gregor for my name. I'll click Say Hello. Before I click the button, let me bring this browser up a little bit so you can see the browser bar down here. You'll see that when I click the button, it will actually submit the form and it will reprocess. It should go fairly quickly since it's a local server, but did you notice that it refreshed the page and actually displayed Hello Gregor down at that page. So very quick and very easy to create a very basic functionality in this web form. In another lesson, getting started with web controls, we'll go through more of the basic controls, and then we'll look at some custom controls, and we'll go deeper into some of the controls and events in later lessons. The main purpose of this lesson is just to get you started with ASP.NET website.